Lizzie Okonkwo was born in a small Nigerian village where poverty was normal and hunger was familiar. Their mud house stood at the far edge of the village with cracked brown walls and a weak zinc roof that rattled whenever the wind blew. There was no electricity, no running water, only silence and struggle. Inside that house lived her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Okonkwo, and their only child, Lizzie. Meals were never certain. Some nights they slept without food, drinking water to calm their stomachs. Even as a child, Lizzie learned how to ignore hunger. Her father, Mazi Okonkwo, was once a strong farmer, respected for his honesty. But sickness came slowly and refused to leave. His body grew weak, and he spent most days lying on a raffia mat, coughing softly while staring at the roof. Lizzie was only 7 years old when her father died. She did not understand death. She only knew her father stopped talking, stopped breathing, and never woke up again. That night, her childhood ended quietly. The burial was small. Poverty does not gather crowds. A few villagers stood quietly as her father was lowered into the ground. No long speeches, no big ceremony, just tears and silence. After the burial, Mrs. Okonkwo sat alone in the house, staring into nothing. She had lost her husband, but life did not wait for her tears. From that day, she became both mother and father to Lizzie. That night, Lizzie sat beside her mother on the bare floor. Hunger growled in her stomach, but fear was louder. She did not know it then, but life had already started testing her strength. Morning came too quickly for Mrs. Okonkwo. Before the sun fully rose, she was already awake, tying her wrapper tightly around her shoulder down to her legs. The house felt emptier without her husband's voice. Silence had replaced companionship, and responsibility pressed heavily on her chest. From that day, Mrs. Okonkwo became everything. She went from house to house asking for farm work. Some people agreed, others mocked her situation. Still, she bent her back and followed them to their farms, determined that her daughter would not drop out of school. On the farms, Mrs. Okonkwo worked under the harsh sun. She weeded cassava ridges, harvested crops, and carried heavy loads despite her tired body. Sweat soaked her blouse, but she did not complain. Every drop of effort was for Lizzie's future. Payment was never enough. Some days she was paid with small money, other days with food items. When school fees approached, fear returned. Mrs. Okonkwo borrowed money again from village women, promising to pay back after the next farm job. When repayment delayed, the embarrassment began. Women came to her house, standing outside and calling her name loudly. They reminded her of her debt in front of others. Mrs. Okonkwo lowered her head and begged for patience, while Lizzie listened from inside. Inside the house, Lizzie sat quietly, hugging her knees. At only 7 years old, she did not fully understand money, but she understood shame. Each insult thrown at her mother settled deeply in her heart, shaping her thoughts about poverty. That night, after the women left, Mrs. Okonkwo sat beside Lizzie and held her hand. She spoke softly about education and hope, even though her own heart was tired. Lizzie listened carefully, not knowing that these moments would shape her future choices. Lizzie loved school more than anything. It was the only place where poverty did not speak loudly. In the classroom, her mind was sharp and her confidence strong. Teachers praised her intelligence, often calling her the future pride of the village. For Lizzie, books were not just paper, they were an escape. But whenever school fees were mentioned,
Fear crept back into her heart. The teacher's voice would echo in the classroom, reminding pupils to bring their fees before the deadline. Lizzie's excitement would fade instantly. She already knew the struggle waiting at home.
At home, Mrs. Okonkwo sat quietly counting small coins on the floor. The money never seemed enough. Her hands trembled slightly as she rearranged the coins again and again, hoping somehow they would multiply. Lizzie watched silently, guilt and fear mixing in her chest. When the money still fell short, Mrs. Okonkwo wrapped her faded shawl around her shoulders and stepped out. She walked from house to house, begging for help once again. Some women listened, others shook their heads in irritation. Each rejection felt heavier than the last. Soon, embarrassment followed her home. Some women stood outside her house, reminding her loudly of old debts. Their voices carried through the village. Mrs. Okonkwo lowered her head and pleaded softly, promising to pay when she could. Shame sat on her shoulders like a heavy load.
Inside the house, Lizzie sat alone, pressing her books tightly against her chest. She felt powerless watching her mother endure humiliation because of her education. Something began to change inside her, an unspoken vow that she would escape poverty one day, no matter the cost.
That night, Mrs. Okonkwo finally gathered enough money to keep Lizzie in school, for now. She lay awake long after Lizzie slept, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she could keep fighting. Outside, the village was quiet, but her worries were loud. Years passed quietly in the village, and Lizzie grew from a fragile child into a sharp and observant girl. As a little girl, she had learned to wake up early, sweep the compound, and help her mother before school. Childhood joy faded quickly as responsibility replaced play. Mrs. Okonkwo's body grew weaker with each passing year, but her determination never failed. At 55 years old, she continued working on people's farms under the hot sun, bending endlessly just to earn small money to keep Lizzie in school. In school, Lizzie stood out again. Now she answered questions confidently while her classmates watched in admiration. Her teachers often shook their heads in disbelief, wondering how such brilliance came from such hardship. But brilliance did not pay school fees. One afternoon, Lizzie returned home to find her mother sitting quietly, her eyes swollen from crying. The fees had increased again, and the borrowed money was no longer enough. At 13 years old, Lizzie began to understand the silent sacrifices her mother made. She watched Mrs. Okonkwo skip meals so she could eat, pretending she was not hungry, while her stomach growled loudly in the night. Whispers began again in the village. Women mocked Mrs. Okonkwo for struggling too hard for one child. They laughed, saying education would not change destiny. But Mrs. Okonkwo never responded. She only worked harder. That night, Lizzie sat beside her mother, her heart heavy. At 14 years old, she promised herself silently that one day, all this suffering would make sense. She did not know yet that Lizzie completed her secondary school education quietly, without celebration or noise. The final examinations came and went, and when the last paper was written, she knew a chapter of her life had closed. There were no photographs to mark the moment, no new clothes to announce success, only a deep sense of relief and a stronger hunger for what lay ahead. Returning home full-time was not easy. Each morning, Lizzie woke up knowing that school was no longer waiting for her. The days felt longer, and the village seemed smaller. Yet, she understood that the journey was not over. It was only paused. Higher education remained her dream, but dreams required money, and money was something they had never had enough of. Together, Lizzie and her mother began to work. Mrs. Okonkwo returned to the farms with renewed determination, while Lizzie joined her whenever she could. They labored under the sun, doing any honest work they found, fetching water, helping on farms, and assisting neighbors. Every coin earned was counted carefully and saved with purpose. The 2 years tested Lizzie's patience. Friends who had help from relatives left for the city, while she remained behind, watching dust rise from the village road as opportunities passed her by. There were moments of frustration and silent tears, moments when she wondered if she was being left behind forever. Still, she held on. During this waiting period, Lizzie did not abandon her books. She borrowed old materials, revised whenever she had the chance, and slowly prepared herself for the entrance examination ahead. At night, after a long day of work, she sat quietly, reading under poor light, refusing to let her mind grow dull. Mrs. Okonkwo watched her daughter with pride and worry. She feared the weight the waiting years placed on Lizzie's heart, yet she admired her discipline. Many times she apologized for the delay, but Lizzie always shook her head. She had learnt patience from her mother's life. Finally, after 2 long years, they had gathered just enough. The money was not plenty, but it was enough to register for JAMB and begin preparing seriously for higher institution. Hope returned to their home, fragile but alive. As Lizzie packed her few books and looked ahead, she believed that the suffering had a purpose. She did not know that the next phase of her journey would test not just her strength, but her values, and that some prices are paid only after dreams come true. The city did not change Lizzie overnight. It happened slowly, like a gentle pull she did not resist. At first, she only watched. She watched the way people walked with confidence, the way girls dressed boldly without shame, the way laughter came easily when money was not a problem. Compared to the quiet village she came from, the city felt alive, too alive to ignore. Lizzie's friends noticed her silence. Marble, tall and chocolate-skinned, always stood out wherever she went. Her blonde hair caught attention, her red body-hugging tops and fitted jeans announced her presence before she even spoke. Stella, fair and curvy, with her long black curly weave on, carried herself like someone who had nothing to prove. Angela, plump and chocolate, dressed to show her curves confidently, her patterned gowns hugging her body as though they were made just for her. Together, they looked like real campus babes, confident, admired, and admired openly. Lizzie, on the other hand, still dressed simply. Her low-cut hair and modest clothes made her look like what she was, a new student, still holding on to her old life. But Marble often laughed gently and told her, "You are too fine to be hiding like this." Stella added that the city respected confidence, not struggle. Angela simply smiled and said nothing, letting her appearance speak for her. The first change was small. Lizzie bought a better pair of shoes, then a fitted top, then a new bag. Each time she dressed up, she felt a strange excitement, like she was becoming someone new. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the village girl who watched dust rise on empty roads. She saw a city girl in the making. Her dressing changed completely. Lizzie began wearing stylish clothes that hugged her slim figure, matching bags and shoes, light makeup that brought out her beauty. People who saw her on campus could no longer tell she was from a poor village. Even her classmates started treating her differently. Attention followed her everywhere she went. Soon, Lizzie started spending more time with the three girls. They took her to places she had never imagined entering: restaurants, lounges, private apartments off campus. She learned how to speak confidently, how to laugh without fear, how to walk like she belonged. Compliments from strangers boosted her confidence, and slowly, the hunger of her past faded from her memory. Phone calls from home became less frequent. When Mrs. Okonkwo called, Lizzie often cut the conversation short, telling herself she was busy. The stories of farm work, tired hands, and village struggles no longer fit the life she was building. She convinced herself that she had moved past that stage. Mabu, Stella, and Angela talked openly about how life really worked in the city. They spoke of powerful men, chiefs, businessmen, politicians, men from different cities who made life easy for them. They never called it anything ugly. They called it connection, soft life, being smart. Lizzie listened carefully, absorbing every word. At first, she told herself she was different, that she was just there to study, that her mother's sacrifices still mattered. But temptation is rarely loud. It whispers. And the more Lizzie tasted the comfort of city life, the more distant her old values became. By the end of the semester, Lizzie no longer dressed like the girl who left the village with a traveling bag and a small handbag. She dressed like the girls who ruled the campus. She laughed louder. She walked taller. And somewhere along the way, she stopped asking herself how much all of this was costing her soul. The city had finally shaped her, and it was not done with her yet. At 21 years old, Lizzie had become almost unrecognizable from the village girl who once counted coins on a mud floor with her mother. The city had polished her on the outside and slowly emptied her on the inside. Mabel, Stella, and Angela were no longer just friends. They were her compass, and they pointed her toward a life of fast money, fast connections, and careless nights. They spoke of men that mattered with confidence, naming chiefs, politicians, business moguls, and influential figures as if they were ordinary acquaintances. To Lizzie, it sounded like power, freedom, and finally escaping poverty forever. It started subtly. Invitations to private lounges, luxury apartments, and high-end hotels replaced lectures and tutorials. Lizzie was introduced carefully, dressed carefully, and spoken about carefully. The men smiled at her ambition and admired her beauty. Compliments came first, then gifts. Expensive phones, designer clothes, bundles of cash slipped into handbags without stress. In the process of chasing this new world, Lizzie crossed a line she once believed she would never cross. Her innocence faded quietly, not in one dramatic moment, but through repeated choices she told herself were necessary. She convinced herself that this was what real life looked like. Money began to flow. Lizzie tasted comfort she had never known. Fine dining, weekend trips, hotel rooms with city views, and flights across different states in Nigeria. Abuja, Lagos, Port Harcourt, Asaba. Each trip came with laughter, cameras flashing, and stories she would never post in full. She started to believe that education was optional when connections were everything. Lectures became occasional appearances. Exams became inconveniences. Her attendance dropped, but her lifestyle rose. Back in the village, Mrs. Okonkwo's health began to fail. Age and years of hard labor finally caught up with her. The woman who once worked on farms from sunrise to sunset now struggled to stand for long. She called Lizzie repeatedly, her weak voice leaving messages filled with worry and hope. But Lizzie was always busy. A flight to catch, a dinner to attend, a car waiting downstairs. She silenced calls, ignored missed notifications, and told herself she would call back later. Later never came. Mabel encouraged her the most. "This life no dey wait for anybody," she would say. Stella reminded her of how poverty had treated her mother. Angela laughed at the idea of returning to village suffering after tasting comfort. Together, they painted neglect as growth and recklessness as freedom. Lizzie listened. She adapted. She changed. The guilt that once disturbed her sleep became quieter with every luxury she touched. As Lizzie skipped lectures and chased soft life, her grades quietly slipped. She stopped caring. University became a backdrop rather than a purpose. Her phone was filled with contacts labeled by nicknames and cities rather than classmates and lecturers. She had everything she once prayed for, yet something essential was missing. Still, the money kept coming, the attention kept growing, and the applause drowned out her conscience. Lizzie standing at a crossroads she refused to acknowledge. One path led back to responsibility, sacrifice, and her mother's fragile voice. The other sparkled with wealth, influence, and dangerous promises. At 21, she chose the glittering road, unaware that every step forward was also a step away from home. The price of forgetting had begun to rise. At 22 years old, Lizzie had become someone people whispered about on campus. Not because of her grades or brilliance, but because of her connections. She knew men who mattered, businessmen, politicians, and influential figures who moved quietly but spent loudly. What started as favors and introductions slowly turned into a system she controlled. Lizzie no longer stood alone. She began introducing other female students, all adults from different departments, to wealthy men who wanted secrecy and convenience. She was the middle link, the trusted name. For every introduction, she was paid. Sometimes it was cash, other times it was gifts, expensive phones, designer bags, weekend trips, promises of apartments that never officially belonged to her. Her hostel room changed, her wardrobe doubled, her circle widened. Mabel, Stella, and Angela stood beside her, impressed and emboldened. They saw Lizzie as smart, strategic, untouchable. On campus, younger girls admired her lifestyle without understanding the cost. To Lizzie, it felt like power. She told herself she was only connecting people, not destroying lives. But walls have ears. Rumors spread quietly at first, then loudly. Names were mentioned in corners. Lecturers began to notice empty seats, declining performances, unexplained absences. Reports reached the school authorities, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Investigations started silently. While the university watched, life struck Lizzie where she never expected. Her mother fell ill back in the village, seriously ill. Mrs. Okonkwo waited by her phone day after day, calling a number that no longer felt like her daughter's. When Lizzie finally answered, it was brief. She promised to call back. She never did. Then, one morning, in the middle of laughter and packing for another trip, Lizzie received a call that ended everything. Her mother was gone. Mrs. Okonkwo died of heartbreak and sickness combined, a body worn out by suffering and a spirit tired of waiting. The news hit Lizzie like a slap. For the first time in years, the city went silent around her. She traveled to the village with Mabel, Stella, and Angela. The same road she once escaped now swallowed her whole. At the burial, she stood dressed in black, expensive but empty. Villagers stared. Some recognized her, others whispered.
She was our hope. She forgot home. Her mother suffered.
Lizzie knelt by the grave of her mother, tears soaking the soil. No apology could wake the dead. After the burial, she returned to school, hollow, distracted, grieving late.
That was when the final blow landed. A formal letter awaited her. Expulsion. The university had concluded its investigation. Evidence, testimonies, reports. Lizzie was found guilty of organizing and profiting from immoral activities involving students, bringing shame to the institution. Her admission was withdrawn with immediate effect. No appeal, no warning, no mercy.
Her friends distanced themselves quietly. Phones stopped ringing. Men who once promised protection disappeared. The doors she thought were open slammed shut in her face. Lizzie sat alone on her hostel bed, holding the letter with trembling hands. In one moment, she had lost her mother, her education, her reputation, and her future. The price of forgetting had finally been calculated, and it was higher than she ever imagined.